I stopped by my wife's office to surprise her, but she was busy. As I waited at her desk, I noticed a fountain pen engraved with my missing daughter's name. Curious, I picked it up. Something clicked inside it, and the wall behind the bookshelf slid open. I froze. My daughter was sitting on a bed, thin and terrified. My name is Richard Harrison. I am 70 years old, the founder of a private real estate development firm right here in Chicago. For most of my life, I built buildings. I focused on acquisitions, on zoning, on concrete and steel. I always provided for my family, but looking back, I missed the things that truly mattered. That realization hits hard, especially after you suffer a mild heart attack, which is exactly what happened to me earlier this year. It makes you reevaluate everything. It slows you down. I handed over the majority of the day-to-day operations of my firm to Derek, my 32-year-old stepson, the chief financial officer. I thought it was the responsible thing to do. I thought I was securing my legacy. But the truth is, I was just making myself vulnerable. My real focus, my only real concern during my recovery, was Lily, my daughter, my biological daughter from my late first wife. Lily is 24, a bright, vibrant young woman. Or she was. 6 months ago, Lily vanished. She just disappeared without a trace. The only thing I received was a single abrupt text message from her phone. It said, "I am tired of your control, Dad. Don't look for me." It broke my heart. It shattered me. I couldn't understand it. We had our disagreements, sure. What father and 24-year-old daughter don't? But we were close. We loved each other. The idea that she would just cut me off, run away, and leave me in the dark while I was recovering from a heart attack, it felt wrong. It didn't sound like her, but the police investigated. They checked her bank accounts, and sure enough, there were regular cash withdrawals happening in different states across the country. The authorities told me she was an adult. She had the right to walk away if she chose. They closed the case. So I was left alone in my big, empty mansion, trying to heal my heart both physically and emotionally, while my wife Patty took care of me. Patricia. Patty. She is 58. We married 10 years ago. She is a high-level psychotherapist, very successful, very well-respected in her field. She runs a private clinic downtown. She has always been supportive, always attentive. She was the one who encouraged me to step back from the business and focus on my health. Last Tuesday, I was looking for a specific tax document. It was something related to the business, a detail I needed to verify. Patty was at her clinic. I went into her home office, a room I rarely enter. It's her space, impeccably neat, filled with psychology books and framed credentials. I opened the top drawer of her filing cabinet looking for the tax folder. I found a stack of envelopes, mostly mail she hadn't gotten around to organizing. As I sifted through them, I accidentally opened her private credit card statement instead of the tax document. I was about to put it back. I respect her privacy, but a few lines on the first page caught my eye. The charges were massive, not for clothes or dinners or travel. They were recurring monthly payments to a specialized medical supply distributor. I looked closer, putting on my reading glasses. The itemized list was incredibly specific. Heavy intravenous sedatives, liquid nutrition bags for IV administration, medical-grade waste disposal bins, all of it being shipped directly to the address of her downtown clinic. I stood there in the quiet of her office, the piece of paper trembling slightly in my hand. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Patty is a talk therapist. She is a psychotherapist, not a psychiatrist. She counsels people. She listens. She does not prescribe medication, and she certainly does not administer intravenous drips. There is no reason, absolutely no logical reason, for a talk therapist to be ordering bulk hospital-grade sedatives and IV nutrition bags to a private counseling office. A cold knot formed in my stomach. The unease wasn't just a fleeting thought. It was a heavy physical sensation. I have spent 50 years in real estate negotiating deals, spotting liars, reading the fine print. My instincts are sharp. And right now, every instinct I possessed was screaming that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Why was my wife, the woman I trusted, secretly buying medical supplies meant for a hospital ICU? And why were they being delivered to her clinic? The silence of the house suddenly felt oppressive. I looked at the framed photo of Patty and me on her desk, taken on our honeymoon in Italy. She looked so happy, so normal. But the credit card statement in my hand told a different story. It told a story of hidden activities, of secrets being kept right under my nose. I carefully folded the statement and put it back exactly where I found it. I closed the drawer. I didn't want her to know I had seen it. Not yet. I needed to understand what I was dealing with before I made a move. The man who built an empire doesn't react on impulse. He gathers facts. And as I walked out of her office, the image of those IV sedatives kept flashing in my mind. I didn't know it then, but pulling that thread was going to unravel everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and the disappearance of my daughter. The next morning, the sunlight streaming through our kitchen windows felt almost mocking. It was a crisp Chicago morning. Patty was standing by the marble island, humming softly as she poured my coffee. She looked exactly like the woman I loved, elegant, composed, and caring. I sat at the table, the folded credit card statement resting heavily inside my jacket pocket. In the real estate business, you never show your hand before the other side makes an offer. I took a deliberate sip. Patty, I was looking for a tax file yesterday and accidentally opened your credit card bill. The charges stood out. Heavy sedatives, intravenous bags, medical waste bins. That is an unusual list for a psychotherapist. I watched her eyes closely. I waited for sudden panic or defensive anger. Instead, she smiled. It was a warm, embarrassed smile. She set the pot down and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Oh, Richard," she sighed, her voice soothing. "I did not want you worrying, not while recovering from a heart attack." She sat next to me. "You know, the addiction crisis breaks my heart." A group of doctors and I started funding an underground outreach clinic in South Chicago. We help homeless addicts detox. Because of zoning laws and strict insurance liabilities, we buy medical supplies privately. I am paying my share out of pocket. It sounded noble. It sounded exactly like the empathetic woman I married. She pulled out her phone, swiping to show digital receipts from a charity. The documents looked perfectly legitimate. The letterheads were flawless. If I were anyone else, I would have apologized and written a check. But I have spent my life reviewing contracts. I know fabricated documents. The margins were too neat. The descriptions lacked standard medical billing codes required by law. It was a good forgery. Before I could press further, the oak doors swung open. Derek walked in. My 32-year-old stepson looked immaculate in a navy suit holding a leather briefcase. The chief financial officer of my company. "Good morning, Richard," Derek said cheerfully, pouring fresh coffee. "Morning, Mom. Are we talking about the Southside Clinic? I told you he would find out." Derek leaned against the counter. "She is an absolute saint, Richard. I actually helped her set up the tax structure for the donations so it would not interfere with our corporate filings. She just did not want to burden you with stressful details while resting your heart." The timing was immaculate. Derek's entrance was smooth, his confirmation perfectly aligned with Patty's narrative. They were finishing each other's sentences, like actors rehearsing a script. I kept my face blank, nodding slowly. "I see," I said. "That is very generous, Patty. I am glad there is a logical explanation." Patty beamed, squeezing my hand. "Thank you for understanding. Now please, no more stressing. Focus on getting your strength back." Derek set his cup down and walked over. His expression shifted seamlessly from cheerful to sympathetic. "Actually, Richard, since we are talking about family, I have news. I did not wake you last night, but I got a phone call late yesterday." My heart skipped a beat. "About what? About Lily?" Derek said softly. He pulled a chair out and sat across from me. "I managed to track down an old college friend of hers. This friend ran into Lily about 3 weeks ago." I leaned forward, gripping the table. "Where in Oregon?" Derek replied, shaking his head sadly. Portland. The friend said Lily was backpacking. She looked thin, but she was traveling with a large group, a very rough-looking crowd. It seems she is just out there trying to find herself fighting her own demons. I know it hurts, Richard, but at least we know she is alive and safe. Oregon. Thousands of miles away. It was the perfect story to stop me from looking for her right here in Chicago. It provided a massive geographical distance that made a physical search impossible for an old man recovering from a dangerous heart condition. Oregon, I repeated slowly. I see. We just have to give her time, Richard. Patty added softly, her eyes brimming with manufactured tears. She will come home when she is ready. We are here for you. You have us. I looked at them both. My devoted wife. My hard-working stepson. They were offering me comfort answers and peace of mind. But my gut was twisting into a tight, agonizing knot. Thank you, Derek, I said, forcing a grateful smile. It does bring me some peace. Of course, Derek said, standing up and checking his expensive watch. I need to get to the office. We have a board meeting at 10. I will handle the quarterly reports so you do not have to worry about a thing. Rest up, Richard. Derek picked up his briefcase and headed for the hallway. Patty stood up to collect the coffee cups, her back turned to me. I remained seated at the table, my eyes fixed intently on the large antique mirror that hung in the hallway just outside the kitchen doors. As Derek stepped into the hall, thinking he was completely out of my line of sight, he paused. Patty turned her head slightly toward the doorway. In the clear reflection of the mirror, I saw it happen. It was absolutely unmistakable. Derek flashed a sharp, arrogant smirk. Patty returned it with a cold, triumphant smile. It lasted less than a single second, a fleeting exchange of absolute victory, before Derek turned away and walked out the front door. My breath caught in my throat. My hands clenched into tight fists under the table. That smirk told me everything. They were working together. They were actively managing me. My daughter was not backpacking with a bad crowd in Oregon, and my wife was not running a secret charity clinic for homeless addicts. I was surrounded by dangerous enemies inside my own home, entirely blind. I stopped by my wife's clinic to surprise her. I waited at her pristine desk, noticing a heavy gold fountain pen engraved with my missing daughter's name. Curious, I picked it up and gave it a twist. A mechanical click echoed through the quiet room, and the massive bookshelf behind me began to slide open. I froze in absolute horror. Behind the hidden wall, sitting on a rusted medical bed, was my daughter. She was thin, covered in bruises, and utterly terrified. If you are just tuning in, take a deep breath. What I am about to tell you is a nightmare that unfolded inside my own home, orchestrated by the people I trusted most in the world. If you have ever been deceived by someone you loved, hit the like button. Subscribe so you do not miss the rest of my story, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from right now. My name is Richard Harrison. I am 70 years old, and for the last 40 years, I built a successful private real estate firm right here in Chicago. I provided a life of absolute luxury for my family, but I was often blind to the shadows growing inside my own house. That blindness nearly cost me everything, especially after a mild heart attack slowed me down earlier this year. During my recovery, I handed over the daily operations of my firm to my 32-year-old stepson, Derek. He was my chief financial officer. I thought I was securing our family legacy, but my real focus was entirely consumed by a much deeper pain. 6 months ago, my biological daughter, Lily, vanished without a single trace. Lily is 24 years old. One morning, I woke up to an empty house and an abrupt text message from her phone. It simply read, "I am tired of your absolute control, Dad. Do not look for me." It shattered my world. We had our disagreements, but running away just did not sound like my little girl. The police opened an investigation, but when they found recent cash withdrawals from her bank accounts across several Western states, they closed the case. They told me she was an adult who chose to walk away. I was left completely devastated in my massive mansion, leaning entirely on my second wife, Patty. Patricia is 58 years old. We married 10 years ago. She is a widely respected psychotherapist with a private clinic downtown. She always played the role of the devoted, supportive wife flawlessly. She encouraged me to rest, to let Derek handle the business, and to accept that Lily just needed time. I believed her completely. Until last Tuesday. I was in Patty's home office looking for a specific tax document related to a joint property investment. Patty was at her clinic. Her office is always impeccably neat. I opened the top drawer of her oak filing cabinet, sifting through a stack of unorganized mail to find the tax folder. Instead of the tax document, I accidentally opened her private credit card statement. I was about to put it back. I always respected her privacy. But a few specific lines on the first page caught my eye, forcing me to stop and put on my reading glasses. The charges were absolutely massive. They were not for expensive designer clothes or high-end dinners. They were recurring monthly payments made directly to a specialized medical supply distributor. I traced my finger down the itemized list, my confusion slowly morphing into a cold dread. Heavy intravenous sedatives, liquid nutrition bags formulated for continuous IV administration, medical-grade hazardous waste disposal bins. All of it was being shipped directly to the address of her downtown therapy clinic. I stood there in the quiet isolation of her office, the paper trembling slightly in my hand. My mind raced frantically, trying to force the pieces to fit together. Patty is a talk therapist. She provides psychological counseling. She listens to people talk about their stress. She is not a medical doctor. She does not prescribe heavy narcotics, and she certainly does not administer intravenous drips to anyone. There is absolutely no logical reason for a psychotherapist to be secretly purchasing bulk hospital-grade sedatives and IV nutrition bags to keep at a private counseling office. A freezing knot formed deep in my stomach. The unease I felt was not just a passing thought. It was a visceral warning. I have spent 5 decades in the real estate business. I know how to spot liars read between the lines and identify when a contract is hiding a trap. My instincts are sharp. And right now, every single instinct I possessed was screaming that something was terribly wrong inside my own home. Why was my wife secretly hoarding medical supplies meant for a hospital intensive care unit? And why were they being delivered to a place where people only go to talk? The silence of the mansion suddenly felt incredibly oppressive. I looked at the framed photograph of Patty and me sitting on her mahogany desk. She looked so normal, so loving. But the credit card statement in my hand told a vastly different story. It whispered of dark secrets being kept right under my nose while I was weak and grieving. I carefully folded the statement exactly along its original creases. I placed it back into the envelope and returned it to the drawer precisely where I had found it. I closed the cabinet silently. I did not want her to know I had seen it. Not yet. A man who builds an empire does not react on impulse. He gathers facts. As I walked out today, the image of those IV sedatives kept flashing in my mind. I did not know it then, but pulling that single thread was going to unravel everything I thought I knew about my marriage and the horrifying truth behind the sudden disappearance of my only daughter. That night, the massive walls of my estate felt like a carefully constructed cone. I returned from the corporate gala playing my part to absolute perfection. I leaned heavily on my cane, allowing my shoulders to slump, acting every bit the frail, recovering 70-year-old man they needed me to be. Patty hovered around me with sickening sweetness. She poured my evening tea, fluffed my pillows, and whispered comforting lies about needing more rest. Every touch of her hand sent a cold shiver down my spine. I swallowed the vitamins she handed me, but the moment she turned her back, I spit the pills into my palm and slipped them into my pocket. I could not trust a single thing she gave me. I climbed into bed and closed my eyes, regulating my breathing to mimic deep sleep. For hours, I lay completely still in the dark. The silence of the mansion was deafening. My mind raced through terrifying scenarios. What were they doing to my company? What were they hiding in that clinic? I waited patiently, listening to the ticking clock in the hallway. I knew the night was far from over. Shortly past 1 in the morning, the crunch of gravel shattered the quiet. I opened my eyes. Beside me, Patty was breathing softly, fast asleep. I slid out from under the comforter, moving with silent precision. I crept toward the large bay window overlooking the front driveway, keeping hidden behind the thick velvet drapes. Down below, Derek's sleek sports car rolled to a stop. The headlights cut through the freezing fog of the Chicago winter. Derek stepped out, but did not head for the front door. Instead, he walked directly to Patty's parked SUV. He popped the trunk and hauled out a heavy black trash bag. My brow furrowed. We have 4 massive commercial disposal bins right in our own side yard. Yet Derek completely ignored them. He threw the heavy bag over his expensive wool coat and began walking down the street. I watched him march through the bitter cold, passing our property line, walking 3 full blocks, until he reached the public dumpsters behind a closed bakery. He tossed the bag inside, looked around nervously, and hurried back. Why would a wealthy executive walk 3 blocks in freezing weather at 1 in the morning to throw away a single bag of garbage? The answer was obvious. He was disposing of something that could never be tied back to our house, something deeply incriminating. I waited until I heard the front door click shut and Derek's footsteps fade up the back staircase. Once the house was silent again, I had to move. I ignored the dull ache in my chest, a lingering reminder of my recent heart attack. Adrenaline flooded my veins, pushing the physical weakness away. I slipped into my darkest winter coat, pulled on my boots, and bypassed the main alarm system using a silent override code. I stepped out into the biting wind. The cold was absolute, piercing right through my layers, but I barely felt it. I stayed in the shadows of the manicured hedges, moving swiftly down the icy sidewalk. My breath plumed in the freezing air as I retraced Derek's exact steps toward the bakery. Every shadow seemed to watch me, but I kept my focus locked on that rusted green dumpster. When I reached the alley, the smell of decaying food and stale beer hit my senses. I pulled out a small pen light, shielding the beam with my palm, and lifted the heavy metal lid. The black bag Derek had carried was sitting right on top. I grabbed the knot. The bag was surprisingly heavy, filled with dense, shifting weight. I hauled it out, my heart protesting against the sudden exertion, but I refused to stop. I could not open it out here in the open street where anyone might drive by. I dragged the bag across the frozen pavement, hauling it all the way back to my property. I bypassed the main house and took it directly into the detached garage, locking the heavy doors behind me. I flicked on the harsh fluorescent work lights. The bright glare illuminated the dark plastic bag sitting on the cold concrete floor. I stood over it for a moment, my chest heaving, dread pooling in my stomach. I knew that whatever was inside this bag was going to change my life irrevocably. I took a deep breath and grabbed a box cutter from the workbench. I sliced the thick plastic open, tearing the bag wide. The contents spilled out onto the concrete. It was not office documents or financial records. It was medical waste. Empty plastic syringes, soiled surgical gloves, and several large discarded containers of liquid nutrition. But that was not what made my blood run entirely cold. Tangled among the medical refuse were several untouched plastic trays of pureed institutional food, and scattered across the bottom of the bag were long, dark clumps of matted hair. Real human hair. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the sharp pain in my joints. I sifted through the terrifying debris with trembling hands. Near the center of the pile, gleaming faintly under the harsh garage lights, was a small object. I reached out and pulled it free from a soiled bandage. It was a delicate silver bracelet. The metal was tarnished, and the intricate chain was caked in thick, dried blood. I rubbed my thumb over the small circular charm hanging from the clasp. An elegant letter L was deeply engraved into the silver. I felt the air leave my lungs. It was the exact bracelet I had custom ordered and locked onto Lily's wrist for her 18th birthday. My beautiful daughter was absolutely not backpacking through the mountains of Oregon. She was certainly not out there trying to find herself. She was here in Chicago, being starved, sedated, and held as a prisoner by the woman sleeping in my bed. My first instinct was to march back into the master bedroom, drag Patricia out of bed, and demand to know where she was keeping my daughter. The rage that boiled inside my chest was a living, breathing thing. But I forced myself to stand perfectly still. I am a businessman. I have survived 50 years in the cutthroat world of commercial real estate because I know how to control my emotions when the stakes are at their highest. If I confronted them now without knowing exactly where Lily was being held, Patricia and Derek would simply deny everything. They would call me crazy. They would use my recent heart attack as proof of a deteriorating mental state. They would destroy the evidence. And worst of all, they would move Lily or they would kill her to cover their tracks. I could not risk my daughter's life to satisfy my own anger. I had to play the game. I had to become the clueless, recovering old man they needed me to be. I placed the silver bracelet into a small plastic bag and slipped it into my coat pocket. I cleaned up the garage, leaving absolutely no trace of the ripped garbage bag or its horrifying contents on the concrete floor. I walked back into the cold night, retraced my steps, and disposed of the remaining trash in a different dumpster. By the time I slipped back into my bed beside Patricia, my body was numb from the freezing temperature, but my mind was burning with absolute clarity. I lay awake for the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling, mapping out my counterattack. The next morning, I played my part flawlessly. I complained about a mild ache in my chest. I allowed Patricia to coddle me. I drank the coffee she poured and smiled when Derek asked how I had slept. As soon as Derek left for the corporate office and Patricia headed downtown to her private clinic, I made my move. I drove straight to a modest, unassuming brick building on the outskirts of the city. I was not going to the police. Not yet. A botched police raid would give Patricia enough warning to erase Lily from existence. I needed a surgeon, not a sledgehammer. I needed Thomas Wright. Thomas has been my personal attorney and closest confidant for over 30 years. He is a brilliant, uncompromising legal mind. Recently, Derek had been actively trying to push Thomas into early retirement, claiming his methods were too old-fashioned for a modern corporate structure. Now I understood exactly why Derek wanted him gone. Thomas was the only man sharp enough to catch them. Thomas was sitting at his heavy mahogany desk when I walked into his office. He looked up surprised to see me alone. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I locked his office door, pulled the plastic bag from my pocket, and dropped Lily's silver bracelet onto his desk. Then I placed my phone down and played the audio recording I had captured at the corporate gala. The room was absolutely silent as Patricia and Derek's hushed, treasonous voices filled the space. Thomas listened to the entire recording without moving a single muscle. His eyes, usually warm and welcoming, turned as cold and hard as steel. When the audio finished, Thomas picked up the blood-stained bracelet. He looked at it for a long time. He did not question my sanity. He simply looked at me and asked what I needed him to do. I needed a completely covert, aggressive background audit of every financial move Derek made since I handed him the role of chief financial officer. I needed to know exactly what they were doing with my company and why they needed Lily out of the picture. Thomas promised to tear the corporate accounts apart, warning that this audit required immense discretion. I promised to buy him all the time he needed by playing the frail, unsuspecting victim at home. For the next 5 days, I lived in a state of agonizing suspense. I shared meals with the monsters who were torturing my daughter. I listened to Derek brag about closing new contracts. I let Patricia hold my hand and tell me she loved me. Every second was pure psychological torture. I had to swallow my disgust and smile knowing that somewhere in the city Lily was suffering. On the 5th night at exactly 2 a.m, my secure prepaid burner phone vibrated in my bedside drawer. I slipped out of the master bedroom, walked quietly into my private study, and locked the door before answering. It was Thomas. His voice sounded heavy, exhausted from days of endless forensic accounting. The news he delivered was catastrophic. Thomas revealed that Derek had not just been mismanaging funds. He had actively embezzled over $14 million from our corporate accounts through a highly sophisticated network of offshore shell companies. The financial damage was immense. But the theft was not the worst part of the phone call. The money was merely a symptom of a much darker, much more permanent motive. Thomas reminded me of a specific clause buried deep within the legal structure of my late first wife's family trust. It was a clause I had almost forgotten. Next week, on the exact day of Lily's 25th birthday, she was legally mandated to automatically inherit 40% of the firm. With that massive share, Lily would gain absolute unilateral veto power over the board of directors. She would have the undeniable authority to fire Derek, initiate a federal investigation into his finances, and completely dismantle the power structure he and Patricia had spent years building. If Lily simply ran away, the trust remained in her name a ticking time bomb. They could not let her vanish, and they could not let her take her seat at the table. They needed her absolutely trapped entirely under their control just long enough to reach her birthday. The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. Thomas continued explaining the grim reality of the legal structure, his voice stripped of any comforting bedside manner. If Patricia and Derek simply murdered Lily and disposed of her body, the police would eventually declare her a missing person. Under Illinois law, if an heir vanishes, their estate is locked in probate for 7 agonizing years before they can be legally declared dead. For 7 years, those shares would be frozen in a legal purgatory. Derek and Patricia would maintain absolute operational control of the company, but they would never truly own it. They would never be able to liquidate the massive assets or sell the firm to a private equity group to cash out their stolen millions. They did not want to manage my real estate empire, Thomas deduced. They wanted to drain it, sell the hollow shell, and disappear with the capital. To do that, they needed Lily alive. They needed her alive for exactly 1 more week. On the morning of her 25th birthday, the trust would mature. 40% of the company would instantly vest into her name. At that exact moment, she would have the legal capacity to sign it all away. Thomas had reviewed the digital security measures we implemented 3 years ago. To execute a transfer of that magnitude, the bank required a multi-factor authentication process. It required a secure digital token, a biometric fingerprint scan, and a live facial recognition capture to authorize the massive shift of equity. They could not fake it. They could not forge a paper signature. They needed Lily breathing conscious and physically present in front of a smart device to transfer her entire birthright directly into Patricia's accounts. The horrifying picture was finally complete. My daughter was not just a prisoner. She was an asset being kept in storage. They were starving her, keeping her heavily sedated with intravenous drugs to prevent her from fighting back or escaping, but keeping her vital organs functioning just enough to process a biometric scan when the clock struck midnight on her birthday. Once the transfer was verified by the bank, Lily would become entirely useless to them. Worse, she would become a liability. They would administer a final lethal overdose of the sedatives, dump her body in a river, and play the role of the grieving family members who tried their best to save a troubled young woman from her own fictional demons. I stood in the center of my darkened study, clutching the secure burner phone to my ear. The sheer evil of their plan was suffocating. My wife, the woman who had kissed my cheek that very morning, the woman who had promised to love and cherish me, was systematically torturing my only child. She was using her professional medical access to procure the very chemicals she was pumping into my daughter's veins. And my stepson, the boy I had mentored and trusted with my life's work, was managing the financial logistics of the kidnapping. I thanked Thomas for his relentless work and hung up the phone. I did not cry. I had shed my last tear when I found that bloody silver bracelet in the garbage. The crushing, paralyzing grief that had weighed down my shoulders for the past 6 months evaporated. In its place, a cold, absolute, and terrifying rage took root deep inside my chest. It was a pure, unadulterated fury. The frightened, recovering 70-year-old man who needed his wife to pour his coffee died in that study. The ruthless, calculating business mogul who had crushed corporate rivals and built a multi-million-dollar empire from scratch returned. I was no longer the victim of this story. I was the architect of their impending destruction. Patricia and Derek thought they held all the cards because they believed I was blind. They thought they were playing a brilliant game of chess against a man who did not even know he was on the board. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had left me out of my cage, and they had given me a reason to hunt them. If I wanted to save Lily, I could not rely on the police to knock on doors and ask polite questions. I needed to find exactly where they were keeping her before her birthday arrived. I needed to track every single movement Patricia and Derek made outside of this mansion. The next day, while Patricia was at her clinic and Derek was at the corporate office, I made a highly confidential phone call to a private security contact I had used years ago for high-stakes corporate espionage. I paid an exorbitant amount of cash for immediate discreet delivery of specialized surveillance equipment. By late afternoon, a plain cardboard package was dropped off at a secure locker across town. Inside were 2 military-grade micro-tracking devices and synchronized audio bugs. These were not standard consumer trackers. They were the size of a coin, completely undetectable by standard anti-surveillance sweeps, and equipped with industrial magnetic mounts and long-lasting lithium batteries. They transmitted encrypted real-time global positioning data and high-definition audio directly to a secure application on my burner phone. That night, I waited until the digital clock on my nightstand read 3 in the morning. I listened to the steady, rhythmic breathing of my wife sleeping peacefully beside me. I slipped out of the bed, moving with the practiced silence of a ghost. I walked down the grand staircase and slipped into the massive climate-controlled garage. I crawled underneath Patricia's luxury sport utility vehicle, the cold concrete biting into my back, and firmly attached the first magnetic tracker deep inside the rear wheel well. Then, I moved over to Derek's sleek sports car, securing the second device just above the exhaust heat shield. The trap was officially set. Now the real game of survival was perfectly ready today. The next 48 hours tested every ounce of my patience. I spent my days sitting in my study with the door locked. I stared at the encrypted tracking application on my burner phone. 2 glowing green dots represented the vehicles driven by the people who had stolen my daughter. I watched Derek commute to the corporate office, completely unaware that his every stop was being documented by Thomas. But my focus remained entirely on the second green dot. Patty had claimed she was funding a secret underground outreach clinic in South Chicago to help homeless addicts detox. She claimed she was purchasing those massive quantities of intravenous sedatives and liquid nutrition bags for that noble cause. But the GPS dot never went anywhere near South Chicago. I watched her route meticulously for 2 consecutive days. She drove from our mansion in the wealthy suburbs straight to her high-security private therapy clinic in the heart of downtown. She stayed there all day and then drove straight home. The entire charity narrative was a complete and utter fabrication. The medical supplies were going directly into her clinic. My daughter was not in some remote location. She was right in the middle of the city, hidden behind the soundproof walls and frosted glass windows of a high-end psychological practice. I knew exactly where Lily was, but knowing was not enough. I could not simply walk into the clinic during business hours. Patty employed a full staff of receptionists and security guards. The building required keycard access for the private wings. I needed absolute privacy to tear that place apart. I needed them to drop their guard completely, and that meant I needed to disappear from their radar. That evening, I joined them for dinner in the formal dining room. The atmosphere was perfectly tense, exactly the way they liked to keep it. Patty served a roasted chicken, pouring me a glass of sparkling water, while Derek talked endlessly about a commercial lease he was negotiating. I waited for a lull in the conversation. I let out a long, heavy sigh and placed my fork down on the porcelain plate. I told them I was feeling incredibly weak. I said my chest was tight, and my anxiety was entirely out of control. I announced that I had spoken to my cardiologist that afternoon, and he strongly recommended a change of scenery. I told them I had booked a 1-week health and wellness retreat at a secluded resort in southern Florida. To make the lie utterly convincing, I added a crucial detail. I told them the retreat required a strict digital detox. I would be leaving my smartphone, my laptop, and all connection to the outside world locked in my desk upstairs. The reaction was immediate. They tried to hide their relief beneath masks of deep concern, but the sudden relaxation in his shoulders and the gleam in her eyes betrayed them. They were absolutely thrilled. Patty reached across the table, squeezing my hand with her cold fingers. She told me it was a brilliant idea. She praised my decision to focus on my recovery, promising that she and Derek would handle everything here in Chicago. They were already calculating how much they could accomplish with me completely uncontactable. The following morning, they were overly eager to help me pack. Patty folded my shirts while Derek carried my leather duffel bag down the grand staircase. They insisted on driving me to the airport together, playing the role of the devoted, caring family to absolute perfection. The drive to the busy international airport felt like a funeral procession, but I maintained my facade. I walked very slowly, leaning heavily on my cane. When we reached the departure drop-off, Patty hugged me tightly. She whispered for me to rest, to find peace, and to stop worrying about Lily. The sheer audacity of her lie made my stomach churn, but I simply nodded and turned away. Derek patted my shoulder, wishing me a safe flight. I walked through the sliding glass doors, never looking back. I navigated the security checkpoints with slow, deliberate steps, letting the cameras record my presence. I arrived at the correct gate and waited with the other passengers. I handed my ticket to the attendant, walked down the jet bridge, and found my first-class seat near the front of the cabin. The flight attendants offered me a warm towel. I settled into the plush leather chair, waiting for the cabin to fill. As the final passengers boarded, I initiated the final phase of my plan. I gripped the armrests and took short, rapid breaths. I signaled the flight attendant, placing a trembling hand over my chest. I told her my heart was racing. I said I had recently suffered a cardiac event and was experiencing a severe panic attack. I apologized, insisting I absolutely could not make this flight. The flight crew reacted with immediate urgency. They asked if I needed an ambulance, but I declined, stating I just needed to disembark and return to my private physician. Within minutes, they escorted me out through the forward exit just before the cabin doors were sealed. I walked back up the jet bridge, moving with purpose. The moment I was out of sight, the frailty vanished. I straightened my posture, gripped my cane, and bypassed the main terminal entirely. I took a service elevator down to the parking garage, moving quickly through the concrete columns. Waiting in the shadows of the third floor was a black, unmarked rental sedan. The engine was already running. I opened the passenger door and slid into the leather seat. Thomas Wright was sitting behind the wheel, his eyes fixed on the exit. He did not ask if I was ready. He already knew. I tossed my cane into the back seat and buckled my seatbelt. I was certainly not going to a health retreat in southern Florida. I was finally going to war. Thomas navigated the rental sedan through the lower-level access roads, avoiding the main thoroughfares where Derek might have connections. We drove in absolute silence. The weight of the impending battle pressed heavily on my chest, but my mind had never been sharper. After evasive driving, Thomas pulled into the dimly lit underground parking garage of a high-rise residential building in the city center. It was a tactical vantage point. Thomas had leveraged a shell corporation to discreetly lease a fourth-floor apartment directly across the avenue from the commercial building where Patty operated her private practice. The apartment was unfurnished, stripped down to the bare hardwood floors and stark white walls, but it held everything I needed. Positioned directly in front of the massive floor-to-ceiling windows was a heavy-duty aluminum tripod. Resting on top of it was a pair of military-grade infrared binoculars, synchronized to a digital recording feed. Beside the tripod sat a parabolic microphone capable of isolating conversations through thick glass and ambient city noise. I walked over to the cold glass. I peered through the binoculars, adjusting the focal lens until the blurred shapes across the street sharpened into crystal-clear resolution. There it was. The third-floor suite of my wife. The frosted glass windows bore her elegant gold leaf logo. It looked exactly like the sanctuary of healing she projected to the world. But I now knew it was a fortress of deception. For the next 48 hours, that unfurnished apartment became my sniper nest. I did not sleep. I barely ate the cold provisions Thomas had stocked in the small kitchen. I simply watched, documenting every single movement my wife made. During the daylight hours, the clinic functioned with sickening perfection. I watched through the narrow gaps in her designer blinds as Patty played the role of the saintly, compassionate healer. Her waiting room was a revolving door of high-paying VIP clients. Wealthy executives, stressed socialites, and vulnerable teenagers sat on her plush velvet sofas pouring their hearts out to a monster. I watched her hand them tissues. I watched her nod with practiced, manufactured empathy. I watched her smile warmly as they left, handing over thousands of dollars for her supposed wisdom. It was a flawless performance. If I had not seen the blood-stained silver bracelet resting in my garage, I would have believed the illusion myself. But I knew the truth. I knew what she was capable of, and I waited patiently for the sun to go down. At 6 o'clock each evening, the clinic officially closed. I watched her receptionist lock the front doors, wave goodbye, and walk down the street toward the subway. The security guards completed their final rounds of the floor, sweeping the corridors before retreating to the lobby downstairs. By 7 o'clock, the entire third floor of the commercial building was completely dark and deserted, except for Patty. She never left. While the rest of the city went home to their families, my devoted wife remained isolated inside her suite. I activated the infrared settings on the binoculars, casting the darkened windows into sharp, glowing contrasts of heat and shadow. I watched her drop the facade of the caring therapist. Her posture stiffened. Her movements became hurried, almost frantic. She paced back and forth across her lavishly decorated main office, checking her phone repeatedly. Around 9 o'clock on the second night, a delivery arrived. Derek pulled his sports car into the alleyway behind her building. I watched through the optics as he hauled 2 large, unmarked cardboard boxes out of his trunk and carried them up the service stairwell. Patty met him at the reinforced steel security door in the back corridor. They exchanged no words. They simply carried the heavy boxes inside and locked the deadbolt. I adjusted the parabolic microphone, aiming the dish precisely at the thick glass of her office window. I boosted the gain, fighting through the ambient hum of the city traffic below. I could hear the sharp sound of packing tape being ripped open. I pressed my eyes against the binoculars, tracking their thermal signatures as they moved through the darkened rooms. Derek unpacked the boxes, pulling out the exact medical supplies I had seen on the forged credit card statement. Thick plastic bags of intravenous fluid, heavy sedatives, medical tubing. Patty gathered the supplies in her arms, moving with the cold efficiency of a seasoned nurse. I tracked her heat signature as she walked out of her main office and down a narrow, windowless hallway. I had studied the public architectural floor plans of that building extensively, with Thomas just hours earlier. I knew every square inch of the registered layout. According to the city zoning permits, that hallway ended in a solid brick wall leading to a mechanical utility shaft. There were no registered rooms at the end of that corridor. But as I watched through the thermal imaging, Patty did not stop at the wall. She reached up, pressing her hand against a disguised biometric scanner hidden behind a framed piece of abstract art. The wall shifted. A heavy concealed steel door swung open, revealing a hidden, unregistered space carved out of the mechanical shaft. She stepped inside the dark void, carrying the heavy bags of intravenous fluids, and the steel door clicked shut behind her, swallowing her whole. My breath hitched painfully in my dry throat. My hands gripped the cold metal of the tripod so tightly my knuckles turned white. The realization slammed into me with crushing force. That hidden, unregistered room was where they were keeping her. My daughter was locked inside a windowless vault, trapped behind a hidden steel door in the middle of the city. The 48 hours of surveillance had given me exactly what I needed. I knew where Lily was. Now I had to figure out exactly how to break through that heavy steel door before her 25th birthday finally arrived. The third night of the stakeout was the hardest. The physical toll of sitting completely still in an unheated, unfurnished apartment was beginning to tear at the edges of my endurance. My back ached with a dull, persistent throb, and my chest felt tight, a lingering reminder of the heart attack that had started this entire nightmare. It was exactly 2 in the morning. The digital clock on the floor cast a faint red glow across the hardwood planks. Outside, the freezing Chicago wind howled through the concrete canyons of the financial district, rattling the thick glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows. I sat on a folding metal chair, gripping a styrofoam cup of black coffee that had gone completely cold hours ago. I brought the bitter liquid to my lips, swallowing the dark sludge just to keep my eyes open. I could not afford to blink. I could not afford to miss a single second. I kept my face pressed tightly against the rubber eye cups of the infrared binoculars. Across the street, the third-floor clinic of my wife was entirely dark. But I was not looking at the frosted glass of her elegant waiting room anymore. I had shifted my focus to a narrow recessed window tucked deep inside the alleyway wall. According to the public blueprints, that window belonged to the mechanical ventilation shaft. But after watching Patty disappear behind the hidden steel door the previous night, I knew the truth. That window was the only source of ventilation for the secret room where they were keeping my daughter. The alleyway below was practically pitch black, illuminated only by the flickering amber glow of a dying street lamp. For hours, nothing moved. The heavy blackout blinds covering that recessed window remained tightly drawn, sealing the horrible secrets of that room away from the world. My mind played cruel tricks on me in the silence. I imagined Lily calling out for me. I imagined the agonizing fear she must be feeling, trapped in the dark, heavily sedated by the woman who was supposed to be her stepmother. The sheer terrifying weight of my own guilt threatened to crush me. I had invited Patricia into our home. I had handed Derek the keys to my empire. I had been so utterly consumed by the pursuit of wealth and corporate dominance that I had failed to protect my own flesh and blood. Every ticking second that passed felt like a physical blow. The coffee cup trembled slightly in my hand. I set it down on the floor, wiped the cold sweat from my forehead, and leaned back into the optics of the binoculars. The infrared lens bathed the brick building across the street in a ghostly green and white hue. I stared at the blackout blinds, praying for a sign, begging the universe for just one microscopic piece of evidence that my daughter was still fighting. Then, at exactly 14 minutes past 2 in the morning, the heavy blind twitched. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but through the magnified lens, it struck me like a bolt of lightning. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I leaned forward, gripping the aluminum tripod with both hands to steady the frame. The bottom corner of the blackout blind shifted upward, moving a fraction of an inch at first, then sliding up a full 2 inches. A sliver of pale yellow light spilled out from the hidden room, cutting through the freezing darkness of the alleyway. I held my breath, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Through the narrow gap in the window, a hand suddenly slammed flat against the cold glass. It was a desperate, frantic strike. The hand was shockingly pale, the skin practically translucent under the harsh interior light. The fingers were painfully thin, bone-thin, trembling violently as they pressed against the pane. I adjusted the focus dial on the binoculars, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The image sharpened with brutal clarity. The wrist attached to that desperate hand was mottled with deep purple and yellow bruises. Tracking up the pale forearm, I saw a horrific cluster of dark red puncture wounds, needle marks, dozens of them overlapping in a chaotic, cruel pattern. They were keeping her sedated, just as the credit card statement had revealed. She was weak, heavily drugged, and starving. But the hand on the glass was moving. The slender fingers scratched frantically at the reinforced window pane. She was trying to find a latch, searching for any possible way to open the heavy glass. I recognized the shape of those fingers. I knew the delicate curve of that wrist. It was Lily. My beautiful, brilliant daughter was right there, just 70 yards away from me, fighting through a medically induced haze to signal the outside world. I opened my mouth, a silent scream tearing at the edges of my throat. I wanted to smash through the window of my apartment, leap across the street, and tear the entire building down with my bare hands. I watched her frail fingers curl into a tight fist, preparing to strike the glass again. But before she could make another move, a thick black leather glove suddenly shot out from the dark interior of the room. The heavy glove clamped brutally around Lily's fragile wrist. I watched in absolute horror as the unseen figure violently yanked her arm backward. Her hand slipped off the cold glass, her fingers dragging down the pane in a final, agonizing motion before she was swallowed back into the terrifying darkness. The heavy blackout blind snapped shut, immediately sealing the window perfectly tight. The sliver of pale yellow light was now entirely gone from my sight forever. The cold alleyway returned to absolute blackness. I staggered back from the heavy aluminum tripod, my weak knees buckling completely underneath me, as the absolutely terrifying, horrifying reality crashed down heavily upon my tired, aching shoulders. It was Lily. She was alive, but barely. The image of that pale, bruised hand sliding down the glass burned itself permanently into my retinas. My beautiful daughter was right there, trapped behind a thick pane of reinforced glass and heavy blackout blinds, suffering in unimaginably horrific ways. My immediate instinct was to smash the window, to scream her name into the freezing alleyway, and to tear the entire building apart until I held her in my arms. But the cold, calculating businessman inside me slammed the brakes on that desperate urge. I stepped back from the aluminum tripod, my breathing ragged, my hands clenched so tightly that my fingernails cut deep into my palms. I could not just kick down the front doors. I could not call the police. Patricia was a highly respected psychotherapist. Her client list included city council members, local judges, and prominent politicians. She had built a pristine reputation that would act as a massive shield against any sudden accusations from a grieving husband. If I sent squad cars to that clinic, her security team would stall them at the front desk. She would have more than enough time to inject Lily with a lethal dose of sedatives, dispose of the evidence, and play the victim of a vicious campaign. A botched police raid would simply give my wife the perfect excuse to silence my daughter permanently. I needed to be a ghost. I needed to infiltrate that fortress, bypass the sophisticated electronic security grid, and reach that hidden utility shaft without triggering a single silent alarm. I turned away from the window and picked up my secure burner phone. I dialed Thomas Wright, who was patiently waiting in the rental car. I told him exactly what I had just seen. I told him about the fresh needle marks on her arms, the violent way she was pulled back into the dark, and the absolute necessity of keeping law enforcement out of the equation for now. Thomas agreed without a second of hesitation. He understood the immense political leverage Patricia wielded in this corrupt city. He told me to stay put, while he ran a deep background check on the building staff. If we could not break through the front door, we were going to walk straight through the back. I spent the next hour pacing the bare hardwood floors of the apartment. My mind was a violent storm of terrifying scenarios and tactical logistics. I mentally mapped the clinic layout I had memorized from the city permits. The hidden room was wedged between the main plumbing lines and the central ventilation hub. Just before 4 in the morning, Thomas returned with a comprehensive dossier. He had identified the one weak link in Patricia's security network. Her clinic employed a private cleaning service, but the commercial building itself retained a single night janitor who managed the heavy refuse and basement utility access. The man was in his late 50s, struggling with massive gambling debts, and had a known history of looking the other way for the right price. He held a universal electronic master keycard that granted unrestricted access to every floor, including the restricted mechanical shafts. He was our only ticket inside the fortress. We left the apartment and drove the sedan down the dark streets, parking near the loading dock of the commercial building. We waited in the freezing silence. My chest ached, but the pure adrenaline flowing through my veins made me feel decades younger. At exactly 5 in the morning, the heavy metal door of the loading dock creaked open. The night janitor stepped out into the freezing Chicago air, lighting a cigarette and pulling his collar up against the bitter wind. He looked exhausted, miserable, and entirely vulnerable. I stepped out of the car, leaving Thomas behind the steering wheel, and walked purposefully into the cold alley. The man flinched as I approached, his hand dropping instinctively toward his heavy flashlight. I did not give him a chance to speak. I stepped into the pale glow of the security light, letting him see the cold determination written on my face. I pulled an envelope from the inside pocket of my coat. I tossed it onto the rusted metal barrel next to him. The envelope landed with a thud. I told him there were $25,000 in cash inside that envelope. It was enough to wipe out his gambling debts and buy him a fresh start. His eyes widened, shifting from the money to my face. Before he could process the offer, I stepped closer, invading his personal space. I lowered my voice to a whisper. I told him that if he refused my offer, I had a team of lawyers ready to expose his debts, ruin his employment, and ensure he spent the rest of his life fighting lawsuits. I was not asking for a favor. I was presenting an ultimatum. I told him I needed his keycard, and I needed him to walk away from the building for the next 24 hours, pretending he had never seen my face. He stared at the envelope, his hands trembling in the cold air. The greed and the fear fought a battle in his eyes. He reached out, snatched the envelope from the barrel, and shoved it deep into his jacket. With a shaking hand, he unclipped the keycard from his belt and pressed it into my palm. He turned and sprinted down the alley without uttering a single word. I walked straight back to the waiting car, the keycard burning like a coal in my fist. I slid into the passenger seat and held it up for Thomas to see. He nodded, his face grim in the dashboard light. He reached into the back seat and hauled a duffel bag over the center console, dropping it onto my lap. I unzipped the main compartment. Inside, resting on the fabric, was a solid steel crowbar, a tactical flashlight, a satellite phone, and a miniature gas mask. I looked at Thomas, questioning the heavy gear. Thomas looked me dead in the eye, his voice devoid of emotion. "They are cornered animals, Richard. You must expect them to bite back." I nodded slowly at Thomas, gripping the heavy canvas strap of the duffel bag. I knew he was absolutely right. Patricia and Derek were playing for a massive fortune, and they would not hesitate to eliminate anyone who stood in their way. I placed the bag on the floorboard and stared out at the dark city skyline. The next few days passed in a blur of agonizing anticipation as I waited for the exact right moment to strike. I maintained my quiet, frail charade at the mansion, communicating with Thomas only through the encrypted satellite phone. Then the morning of that 25th birthday finally arrived. It was the day the trust would legally mature. It was the day they planned to force her to transfer her entire birthright, and it was the day I was going to tear their pristine world apart. I sat in the back of an idling rental car parked 2 blocks away from the clinic. My burner phone displayed the green tracking dot of Patricia driving over. She was already inside the building. Thomas monitored the front entrance through his binoculars. He turned to me and confirmed our narrow window of opportunity. Patricia was standing in the main lobby, personally greeting a prominent state senator who required absolute discretion. She would be occupied with her high-profile client for exactly 30 minutes. That was all the time I had. I stepped out of the car, hauling the heavy duffel bag over my shoulder. The freezing morning air bit into my lungs, but my focus was unbreakable. I walked quickly down the quiet alleyway, avoiding the primary security cameras, exactly as we had planned. I reached the rusted service door near the loading dock and pressed the stolen master electronic keycard against the hidden scanner. A faint click echoed through the brick corridor, and the heavy metal door swung open. I slipped inside the dimly lit service hallway, pulling the hood of my dark jacket up over my head. I navigated the basement labyrinth from memory, locating the freight elevator designated strictly for maintenance crews. I pressed the call button and waited, listening to the agonizingly slow grind of the mechanical gears. The elevator arrived and I stepped into the cramped metal carriage. I swiped the master keycard over the control panel and pressed the button for the 3rd floor. The ascent felt like an eternity. The low hum of the machinery masked the frantic pounding of my heart. My chest ached with a familiar dull pressure, but I forced the physical weakness away. I was not a recovering patient today. I was a father coming to save his child. The elevator jolted to a stop and the heavy doors parted. I stepped out into the pristine carpeted hallway of her private clinic. The air smelled faintly of lavender and expensive leather. It was a place designed to project absolute tranquility and safety, a perfect illusion masking the horrific reality hidden within its walls. I moved silently toward the main suite at the end of the hall. I pressed the master keycard against the digital lock on her office door. The light flashed a welcoming green. I pushed the door open, stepped inside the lavishly decorated suite, and immediately locked the heavy deadbolt behind me. I dropped the duffel bag onto the floor and pulled out the tactical flashlight. I had less than 20 minutes before Patricia finished her session with the senator. I began to search the room with frantic, desperate energy. I moved along the perimeter, pressing my hands against the expensive mahogany wall panels, tapping the wood, and listening for any hollow echoes. I pushed aside the heavy velvet window drapes, inspecting the frames for hidden latches. I opened the massive storage closets, tossing boxes aside to check the baseboards. I dropped to my knees, peeling back the edges of the thick Persian rugs to look for concealed floor safes or trapdoors. I found absolutely nothing. The office was meticulously clean, organized, and entirely devoid of any mechanical secrets. It looked exactly like a normal, upscale psychiatric workspace. There were no hidden seams in the drywall. There were no disguised biometric scanners behind the abstract artwork, despite what I had seen through the thermal optics. I paced the length of the room, my breathing growing shallow and rapid. Panic threatened to cloud my judgment. I checked the heavy diving watch on my wrist. I had exactly 10 minutes left. If Patricia returned and found me locked inside her private sanctuary, she would instantly trigger the silent alarm and summon the building's security guards. The element of surprise would be completely lost, and Lily would be moved before I could ever reach her. I ran my hands through my sparse gray hair, staring blankly at the massive oak desk sitting squarely in the center of the room. I had to be missing something. The thermal imaging from my surveillance did not lie. I had watched her walk through a solid wall in this exact vicinity. I stepped closer to the desk, my eyes scanning the perfectly arranged surface. Her laptop was locked. Her appointment calendar was closed. I leaned heavily against the polished wood, my shoulders sagging under the immense weight of my perceived failure. I was out of time, out of options, and about to give up completely. Then a brilliant glint of polished metal caught the ambient light spilling from the hallway. I froze instantly in my tracks. Resting perfectly aligned on a genuine leather stationery pad was a heavy, solid gold-plated fountain pen. I reached out with trembling fingers and picked it up. It was cold and surprisingly heavy, far denser than any standard writing instrument. I slowly rolled the smooth gold barrel over in my palm, examining the delicate, pristine craftsmanship. Near the very base of the pen, deeply and beautifully engraved into the gleaming metal surface, were two clear words that made my blood freeze completely. Lily Harrison. I stared at the two words deeply engraved into the gleaming gold surface. Lily Harrison. My thumb traced the delicate lettering, feeling the cold, hard reality of my daughter's name etched into an object sitting in the center of her kidnapper's desk. The heavy, solid gold fountain pen felt entirely out of place. It was far too thick, far too dense to be a simple writing instrument. I gripped the smooth barrel with my left hand and firmly grasped the cap with my right. I twisted the cap. It did not unscrew smoothly like a normal pen. Instead, it offered a heavy, spring-loaded resistance. I twisted it harder, forcing the mechanism against its internal tension until a sharp, distinct click echoed through the absolute silence of the quiet room. The sound was immediately followed by a deep, resonant shudder that vibrated through the hardwood floorboards directly beneath my boots. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I looked up from the desk. The massive floor-to-ceiling oak bookshelf that dominated the rear wall of the office began to move. It did not swing outward on hinges. Instead, it slid silently and smoothly to the left, gliding along a set of perfectly concealed greased steel tracks built directly into the crown molding and the floor. Rows of thick medical texts, framed diplomas, and decorative sculptures shifted aside with heavy mechanical precision. Behind the beautiful oak facade was a recessed alcove lined with raw cinder block. Standing in the center of that alcove was a heavy industrial-grade steel door. I dropped the gold pen onto the desk and walked slowly toward the hidden entrance. The steel door had no handle, no keyhole, and no visible hinges. The only feature on its cold gray surface was a sleek digital keypad illuminated by a faint, pulsing red light. I stood inches away from the barrier, my mind racing through the infinite possibilities. I did not have a hacking device. I did not have a heavy explosive to breach the steel. If I entered the wrong code and triggered a lockdown protocol, Patricia would be alerted instantly. I closed my eyes, trying to channel the ruthless, calculating executive I had been before my illness. I needed to think exactly like Patricia. She was arrogant, meticulous, and entirely fixated on the massive financial payout waiting at the end of this twisted game. Everything she did was centered around one specific deadline. I raised my trembling hand and extended my index finger toward the glowing numeric pad. I typed in the 6 digits representing the exact date of Lily's 25th birthday. The very day her massive trust fund was scheduled to vest. The very day Patricia planned to drain my empire and dispose of my only child. I held my breath as I pressed the final number. The red light on the keypad blinked once, hovered for an agonizing second, and then shifted to a brilliant solid green. A loud, heavy metallic thud resonated from deep within the doorframe as the primary locking bolts retracted. The thick steel door hissed as the vacuum seal was broken, slowly unlatching and swinging inward under its own massive weight. A sudden wave of freezing antiseptic-smelling air hit me squarely in the face. It was the sharp, sterile scent of rubbing alcohol, iodine, and sickness. It was a smell that belonged in an intensive care unit, not hidden behind a luxury psychiatric office in the middle of the commercial district. I stepped over the steel threshold, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I reached back and carefully pulled the heavy door shut behind me, ensuring the green light flashed red again. I was entirely locked inside the hidden ventilation shaft, cut off from the main clinic, surrounded by absolute suffocating darkness. I reached into the pocket of my dark jacket and pulled out the tactical flashlight Thomas had provided. I pressed the rubber button on the tail cap. A brilliant, concentrated beam of white light pierced the thick darkness, cutting a path through the frozen, stale air. I swept the light across the hidden space. It was a long, narrow concrete corridor, entirely disconnected from the building's central heating system. The walls were lined with exposed copper pipes and thick silver ventilation ducts, wrapped in heavy industrial insulation. But the floor was covered in thick, soundproof rubber matting, absorbing the sound of my footsteps as I moved deeper into the terrifying void. As I walked down the narrow corridor, the beam of my flashlight revealed the horrifying extent of Patricia's meticulous planning. Stacked against the cinder block walls were dozens of cardboard boxes identical to the ones Derek had carried up the service stairwell. I moved the light over the open cartons, seeing hundreds of plastic intravenous fluid bags, boxes of sterile syringes, and dozens of dark glass vials filled with powerful clear liquid sedatives. A tall metal rolling cart sat near the corner, holding a sophisticated digital heart rate monitor and a portable defibrillator unit. She had built a fully functional, completely off-the-grid medical prison cell right under the noses of the city inspectors. I pushed past the medical supplies, my hands trembling violently as I approached the end of the concrete corridor. A thick plastic hospital curtain hung from a metal track suspended from the ceiling, separating the hallway from the final chamber. I could hear the faint, rhythmic beeping of a medical monitor coming from behind the heavy plastic barrier. It was a slow, steady pulse that sounded incredibly weak, incredibly fragile. I reached out, my fingers gripping the edge of the curtain. I took a deep, steadying breath, preparing myself for whatever horrors lay on the other side. I ripped the heavy plastic curtain back, sweeping the bright beam of my tactical flashlight across the small freezing room, to finally reveal the absolute horrifying truth of what they had truly done to my beautiful only daughter. The heavy plastic curtain fell away, dropping heavily against the concrete wall with a hollow thud. I swept the blinding white beam of my tactical flashlight across the freezing space. The hidden cell was entirely windowless, lined top to bottom, with thick, dark acoustic foam meant to absorb sound. In the absolute center of this barren concrete tomb sat a rusted mechanical hospital bed. Lying on top of the thin plastic mattress was my beautiful Lily. The breath was knocked out of my lungs with the force of a physical blow. The flashlight trembled violently in my grasp as the horrific reality of her condition washed over me in crushing waves. My vibrant, energetic daughter had been reduced to a literal skeleton. Her skin, once glowing with youth, was stretched paper-thin over her protruding collarbones and sunken cheekbones. It possessed a sickly, translucent pallor that spoke of months without sunlight. A heavy industrial steel chain was wrapped tightly around her left ankle, secured by a heavy padlock directly to the reinforced metal frame of the rusted bed. Thick plastic intravenous lines snaked down from a rolling metal pole beside her, disappearing into the dark, overlapping bruises that covered both of her frail arms. They were pumping her veins full of potent liquid sedatives and synthetic nutrition, keeping her body trapped in a perpetual twilight state between life and death. The air in the cell was suffocatingly thick with the stench of chemical antiseptics and raw human suffering. I could not move. For a long, agonizing moment, my boots remained cemented to the rubber matting. My mind simply could not comprehend the magnitude of the evil I was witnessing. Right outside that heavy steel door, Patricia sat on velvet chairs sipping herbal tea and pretending to be a paragon of healing and empathy. She smiled at her wealthy clients, while her stepdaughter lay starving and chained like an animal in a hidden dungeon just a few feet away. The sheer, unfathomable cruelty of it threatened to break my sanity. I forced myself to take a step forward, the rubber soles of my boots squeaking softly against the floor. The faint sound cut through the rhythmic beeping of the heart rate monitor. On the rusted bed, Lily stirred. Her head turned, slowly rolling against the thin pillow with agonizing effort. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, were sunken deep into her skull and completely glazed over with a thick, cloudy haze from the heavy narcotics. She squinted against the harsh glare of my flashlight. I quickly lowered the beam, directing the light away from her face and letting the ambient glow illuminate my features. I pulled the heavy hood of my dark jacket down. I stepped into her field of vision, tears streaming hot and fast down my weathered cheeks. Recognition bloomed in her dull, exhausted eyes. A violent shudder ripped through her frail body. She tried to raise her head. She opened her cracked, blistered lips to scream my name. She pushed every ounce of her remaining strength into her lungs, trying to cry out for her father. But there was no sound. Instead of a scream, only a hollow, raspy croak emerged from her throat. It was a dry, broken wheeze that sounded like dry leaves scraping against stone. The horrific truth slammed into my chest. Her vocal cords were entirely ruined. For 6 agonizing months, locked inside this soundproofed concrete vault, my brave girl had screamed for help. She had shrieked and cried and begged for someone to hear her, hour after hour, night after night, until her throat had literally bled and her vocal cords had completely shredded. No one had come. No one had heard her. Because the woman I married had designed this hell specifically to swallow her cries. The dam broke. The stoic, calculating businessman evaporated into the freezing air. I dropped the heavy duffel bag and the flashlight onto the floor. I sprinted across the short distance, falling hard onto my knees beside the rusted metal frame of her bed. I reached out with shaking, desperate hands, gently framing her sunken, hollow face. Tears poured from my eyes, falling onto her cold, pale cheeks. I whispered her name over and over again, my voice choking on the overwhelming wave of grief and pure, unadulterated rage. She raised her free hand, her trembling fingers weakly grasping the thick fabric of my dark jacket. She clung to me with the desperate strength of a drowning victim. I did not wait for the emotion to pass. I let the fury fuel my movements. I grabbed the thick plastic tubes feeding the harsh chemicals into her delicate veins. I did not care about medical protocols or the sterile environment. I yanked the intravenous lines out of her bruised arms with a swift, violent pull. Lily let out a soft, sharp gasp as the needles slid free, tiny beads of dark blood pooling on her pale skin. I pressed my thumbs against the puncture wounds to stop the bleeding, murmuring frantic promises that she was finally safe. I looked down at the heavy steel chain cutting into the delicate skin of her ankle. The padlock was thick industrial metal, practically impervious to brute force. But I had come prepared for a war. I reached behind me, my hand blindly searching the floor until my fingers wrapped around the cold, textured grip of the solid steel crowbar Thomas had placed in my bag. I stood up, gripping the heavy weapon with both hands. I wedged the curved, forked end of the crowbar deep beneath the locking mechanism of the heavy padlock. I planted my boots firmly on the rubber floor, matting, and pushed down with every last ounce of strength left in my aging body. The metal shrieked and groaned under the immense pressure. I gritted my teeth, ignoring the shooting pain radiating through my chest and arms. I was not going to fail her ever again. The metal of the heavy padlock groaned in protest as I threw the entire weight of my body onto the solid steel crowbar. My shoulders burned with a fierce, agonizing fire, and my chest seized with the familiar suffocating tightness of my weakened heart, but I refused to stop. I ground my teeth together, planting my boots firmly against the soundproof rubber matting on the floor, using every single ounce of leverage I could physically muster. The thick industrial chain rattled against the rusted frame of the medical bed. Beside me, Lily watched with wide, terrified eyes. She reached out with her free, trembling hand, her frail fingers weakly grasping the fabric of my dark coat. She opened her cracked, blistered lips. She forced a breath into her ruined throat, fighting through the thick, cloudy haze of the heavy narcotics that had kept her paralyzed for half a year. A raspy, broken whisper scraped out of her mouth, so quiet I had to lean my head down just inches from her face to hear the horrifying truth she was trying to desperately convey. She told me everything. Her voice was a fragile, ruined croak, a sound that tore my heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. She told me about that night 6 months ago, the night she supposedly packed her bags and ran away. She had not run away. She had gone into the main kitchen of the mansion for a glass of water late at night. She had walked in on Derek standing near the counter. He was holding my prescription bottles. She hid in the shadows and watched in absolute horror as my trusted stepson carefully opened the capsules of my daily heart medication, dumping the life-saving powder down the sink drain and replacing it with a fine white synthetic compound. They were poisoning me. They had orchestrated my sudden cardiac failure. They had deliberately destroyed my health so I would be weak, confused, and entirely dependent on Patricia for my survival. Lily told me she had panicked. She did not know what to do, so she made the fatal mistake of confronting Patricia the following morning. She had trusted her stepmother. She had looked the monster right in the eye and demanded an explanation. Patricia had smiled her sweet maternal smile, offered Lily a cup of tea to calm her nerves, and slipped a massive dose of liquid sedatives into the mug. Lily said she remembered feeling dizzy, her legs giving out, as the kitchen floor rushed up to meet her. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was Derek standing over her, holding her personal smartphone, typing out the cruel fake text message that would shatter my world and convince me my only child had abandoned me. For 6 agonizing months, they had kept her trapped inside this freezing, windowless concrete tomb. They had pumped her veins full of synthetic nutrition and heavy narcotics, keeping her in a medically induced coma. They starved her, reducing her to a frail skeleton, preserving her vital organs just enough to keep her breathing. They were waiting for a specific date on the calendar. They were waiting for today. Lily squeezed my coat, her bruised, emaciated fingers trembling with a fresh wave of absolute terror. She choked on a dry sob, her eyes darting toward the heavy steel door behind me. She whispered that they were coming. She told me Derek was bringing the banking biometric scanner this morning. Today was her 25th birthday. The trust had legally matured. Once they forced her to press her thumb against the glass screen and scan her face, the massive transfer of wealth would be complete. The millions would flow into their hidden offshore accounts. And then she whispered, the tears streaming freely down her sunken cheeks. They were going to inject her with a final lethal overdose of the heavy sedatives. They were going to stop her heart, roll her body into a canvas bag, and dump her in the freezing waters of the river. The sheer, unadulterated evil of their plan washed over me, replacing my crushing guilt with a cold, absolute, and terrifying fury. The men who had built a corporate empire, who had crushed ruthless rivals and commanded boardrooms, returned with a vengeance. I was not going to let them touch a single hair on her head. I gripped the heavy steel crowbar with a renewed savage strength. I leaned back, putting the entire force of my back and shoulders into one final desperate push. A sharp, deafening snap echoed through the silent medical cell. The thick steel shackle of the heavy padlock shattered, the metal fracturing under the immense pressure. The heavy chain slid off the rusted bed frame, falling to the rubber matting with a heavy, satisfying clatter. I dropped the crowbar and immediately fell to my knees. I scooped Lily up from the thin plastic mattress. She weighed practically nothing. Her frail, broken body felt like a fragile collection of hollow bones wrapped in cold skin, but she was alive. I pulled her tightly against my chest, wrapping my arms around her trembling shoulders. I buried my face in her tangled hair, crying tears of profound relief. I promised her we were leaving. I promised her she was safe, that I would kill anyone who tried to stop us. I gathered her into my arms, slowly standing up, prepared to carry her out of this horrible nightmare and down to the waiting car where Thomas was ready to get us to safety. I turned toward the exit, ready to leave the concrete cell behind forever. But the moment I shifted my weight, a low mechanical hum vibrated through the floorboards. It was a sound I recognized instantly. It was the heavy, greased steel tracks of the hidden bookshelf moving. I froze, clutching Lily tightly against my chest. I watched in absolute horror as the massive industrial-grade steel door began to slowly, silently slide shut. The opening narrowed, the bright, warm light from the main clinic hallway shrinking second by second. And standing perfectly still in the center of that narrowing gap, illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights of the corridor, was my wife. Patricia was not wearing her elegant, saintly therapist smile. The compassionate maternal mask she wore for the world had completely melted away, revealing the cold, dead, empty stare of a true psychopath. She stood perfectly upright, wearing a tailored designer suit, completely unbothered by the horrific reality of the room she had built. In her right hand, she casually held the heavy, solid gold-plated fountain pen engraved with my daughter's name. She tapped the smooth gold barrel rhythmically against the palm of her left hand. Standing just over her shoulder, partially hidden in the hallway shadows, was Derek. He held a sleek, digital biometric tablet in his hands, his face a portrait of calm, calculated greed. They had not gone to the lobby to greet a senator. They had known exactly where I was. They had set a trap, and I had walked right into it. Patricia tilted her head slightly, her dead eyes locking onto mine. She did not scream. She did not act surprised. Her voice was smooth, even, and dripping with sickening amusement. She told me she had wondered exactly when I would finally figure it out. She said she had noticed the tiny tracking devices hidden beneath the wheel wells of their vehicles 2 days ago. She knew I had not gone to a health retreat in southern Florida. She knew I had been watching the clinic. She had simply let me break inside. She had let me find Lily, waiting patiently in the hallway for the perfect moment to seal us both inside the tomb. She smiled, a thin, cruel, horrifying curve of her lips. She told me it was actually quite romantic in a tragic sort of way. She said she had been trying to figure out how to handle my sudden burst of investigative energy, but now the problem had solved itself beautifully. The grieving father, heartbroken by his daughter's disappearance, suffers a tragic mental break, wanders away from his secure health retreat, and tragically dies of a massive heart attack while searching for her in the city. A perfect, clean narrative for the police. I stepped forward, my jaw clenched, ready to set Lily down and charge the door, ready to tear Patricia apart with my bare hands. But I was too late. Patricia took a single step back into the bright hallway. She looked at the two of us huddled together in the freezing dark. She whispered a sweet, mocking goodbye, telling us that now we could die together. She reached out and pressed her palm against the hidden keypad on the wall. The heavy steel door lurched forward with a final violent hiss. I lunged toward the gap, but the massive slab of industrial metal slammed shut, inches from my face. The heavy locking bolts engaged with a loud, deafening metallic crash that shook the entire concrete room. The bright light from the hallway was instantly severed. The red light on the internal keypad blinked once and died completely. We were locked inside the soundproof windowless vault. The air grew instantly colder. I stood in the absolute pitch-black darkness, holding the frail, trembling skeleton of my daughter in my arms, listening to the horrifying silence of our own impending grave. The absolute darkness of the sealed room was suffocating. The only sound left in the freezing void was the weak, ragged breathing of my daughter and the frantic, heavy pounding of my own failing heart. I slowly lowered Lily back down onto the thin plastic mattress of the rusted medical bed, guiding her frail body with extreme care so I would not bruise her further. I could not see her face in the pitch black, but I could feel her cold, bony fingers clinging desperately to the fabric of my coat. She was shaking uncontrollably, her tiny, fragile frame convulsing with a mixture of terror and the severe chemical withdrawal of the sedatives leaving her system. I stroked her tangled hair, whispering soft, useless promises into the dark, telling her I would find a way out, telling her I would not let them win. But as I stood there in the absolute silence, running my hands blindly over the smooth, impenetrable surface of the heavy steel door, the sheer impossibility of our situation began to settle heavily over my shoulders. Patricia had designed this hidden vault to be completely soundproof and entirely invisible to the outside world. The concrete blocks surrounding us were thick enough to absorb a gunshot. The heavy steel door was industrial grade, designed to withstand extreme force, and secured by a digital locking mechanism that was now completely disabled from the inside. There were no exposed wires, no hinges to pry apart, and no weak points in the metal frame. I grabbed the solid steel crowbar from the floor, swinging it violently in the dark. I struck the center of the heavy door with every ounce of my remaining strength. The impact sent a painful, jarring shockwave up my arms and deep into my chest, but the metal did not even dent. I struck it again and again, swinging blindly in the freezing air, screaming into the void until my lungs burned and my heart hammered a dangerous, erratic rhythm. The thick acoustic foam lining the walls swallowed the deafening clang of the metal, deadening the sound instantly. No one was coming to save us. No one in the bustling city outside even knew this room existed. I dropped the heavy crowbar, gasping for breath, as I leaned my forehead against the freezing steel door. The reality of Patricia's brilliant, evil trap was absolute. She did not need to inject Lily with a lethal overdose anymore. She did not need to risk moving a body or covering up a violent crime scene. She simply had to leave us locked inside this forgotten mechanical shaft. The ventilation was already cut off. The air was growing stale and thin. Without food, without water, and without a steady supply of oxygen, we would simply waste away in the dark, becoming two forgotten ghosts, hidden behind a bookshelf in a luxury psychiatric clinic. I turned back toward the rusted bed, feeling my way through the pitch-black room until my hands found Lily's trembling shoulders. I sat down on the edge of the mattress, pulling her frail body onto my lap. I wrapped my arms around her, trying to share the remaining warmth of my body. She rested her head against my chest, her ruined, bleeding vocal cords making a soft, terrible wheezing sound as she cried silently into the darkness. I held my only child, the brilliant, beautiful girl I had failed to protect from the monsters living inside our own home. I thought about the massive empire I had built, the millions of dollars sitting uselessly in offshore accounts, the corporate rivals I had ruthlessly crushed. All of it meant absolutely nothing now. I would have traded every single penny, every property, every ounce of power I possessed, just to see the sun shine on my daughter's face one more time. As the freezing air began to slowly drain the heat from our bodies, and the heavy silence of the concrete tomb settled permanently around us, I held Lily tightly in the dark, praying for a miracle I knew would never come, waiting for the end of the story we had blindly walked into. The absolute darkness of the sealed room was suffocating, a heavy, oppressive blanket pressing down upon us. But I refused to let despair claim my mind. I sat on the edge of the rusted medical bed, cradling Lily against my chest. Her frail body trembled violently in my arms, her ruined throat emitting terrible raspy wheezes as she struggled to draw breath in the freezing, stale air of the concrete tomb. Every instinct in my tired body screamed at me to panic, to batter my bloody fists against the impenetrable steel door until my bones shattered, but I forced my racing heart to slow its frantic rhythm. Panic was exactly what Patricia wanted. Panic leads to fatal mistakes, and I could not afford a single mistake. Suddenly, a sharp, heavy mechanical clank echoed from the ventilation ducts in the ceiling directly above us. The faint ambient hum of the electrical circuits running through the walls died instantly. The red standby light on the internal keypad, the only microscopic source of illumination left in the room, vanished completely. We were plunged into a terrifying, absolute blackness. And then I heard it. It started as a low, continuous hissing sound echoing from the metallic ventilation grates directly above the medical bed. A thick, pungent odor began to quickly fill the confined space. It was not the sterile scent of medical antiseptics anymore. It was harsh chemical and distinctly toxic. It burned the inside of my nostrils and scorched the back of my throat with every single shallow breath. Patricia was flooding the sealed room with a highly toxic chemical gas. Her horrific plan became instantly painfully clear. She was going to asphyxiate us in the dark, leaving no visible trauma, and then she would undoubtedly ignite the clinic. She was preparing to stage a tragic accidental fire, to burn the bodies, destroy the hidden room, and completely erase all evidence of her monstrous crimes. Lily began to choke. Her frail fingers clawed desperately at my heavy coat as the toxic fumes entered her compromised, weakened lungs. She writhed against me, a silent, agonizing scream tearing at her ruined vocal cords. But I did not freeze. I did not surrender to the blinding terror. I reached down into the absolute darkness, my hand sliding frantically across the cold rubber matting on the floor, until my fingers brushed against the heavy canvas fabric of the duffel bag Thomas had given me. I grabbed the bag, pulling it up onto my lap, my hands moving with practiced mechanical precision. I ripped the main zipper open. I bypassed the cold steel of the crowbar and the tactical flashlight, my fingers searching for the specific piece of equipment Thomas had insisted I carry for emergency extraction. I found the smooth synthetic rubber of the military-grade miniature gas mask. I pulled it out, my hands moving swiftly over the adjustable nylon straps. I leaned down, finding Lily's face in the dark. I whispered to her, my voice steady and commanding, telling her to hold her breath, promising her that I had her safe. I pressed the heavy rubber mask firmly over her nose and mouth, pulling the thick straps over the back of her head, ensuring a perfectly tight, airtight seal against her sunken cheeks. I heard the sharp mechanical click of the filtration valves engaging. Lily gasped, drawing in a deep, desperate lungful of clean, purified air. Her rigid, trembling body instantly went slack in my arms as the life-saving oxygen flooded her system. She was safe from the gas, but the toxic fumes were now searing my own aging lungs. My vision swam in this pitch-black dark, a heavy, dizzying pressure building behind my eyes, but I pushed the blinding pain away. I reached back into the duffel bag and pulled out the heavy, untraceable satellite phone. Patricia had undoubtedly activated electronic signal jammers in her clinic to block standard cellular frequencies, ensuring no one could call for help from within her secure fortress. But this specific device did not rely on local cellular towers. It bypassed the local grid entirely, connecting directly to an encrypted orbital network overhead. I held my breath, fighting the overwhelming urge to cough as the toxic gas rapidly filled the small concrete room. I pressed the power button. The small, bright blue screen illuminated the darkness, casting a ghostly, flickering light over Lily's face, hidden safely behind the dark military mask. I looked at the signal bars on the illuminated screen. They were completely full. The local jammers could not touch the encrypted signal. My lungs screamed for oxygen, my chest burning with a fierce, agonizing heat, but I ignored the mounting pain. I pressed the single speed dial button programmed into the device. The secure line rang only once before a deep, authoritative voice answered. It was Captain Jenkins, a veteran tactical commander, and one of my most trusted corporate security contacts. I spoke into the receiver, my voice a harsh, raspy whisper, choking on the thick, toxic fumes filling the sealed room. I told him we were trapped inside the hidden vault on the 3rd floor. I gave him the exact coordinates of the building. My words rushed and desperate. I commanded him to breach the building immediately. I told him they were flooding the room with poison, preparing to burn the evidence, and we had absolutely no time left to spare. Jenkins did not ask any questions. He simply barked a single sharp confirmation, and the secure line went dead. I dropped the satellite phone onto the mattress, burying my face deep into the heavy canvas of the duffel bag. To filter the toxic air, wrapping my arms tightly around my daughter, and waiting for the violent storm to finally break. Through the incredibly thick industrial steel door sealing us inside the concrete vault, the muffled, distorted sounds of the outside world slowly bled into the dark. My ears strained against the heavy silence, picking up the faint, rhythmic splashing of heavy liquid hitting the carpeted floors of the main office suite. The sharp, unmistakable stench of industrial gasoline began to seep through the microscopic gaps around the heavy doorframe, mixing lethally with the toxic gas currently choking my lungs. Derek was moving frantically on the other side of the wall, dousing the expensive Persian rugs, the mahogany furniture, and the custom cabinetry in highly flammable accelerant. I could hear his muffled voice vibrating through the cold metal, a sickening, arrogant laugh echoing down the hidden corridor. He was practically vibrating with nervous excitement, celebrating his perceived ultimate victory. He truly believed he had won. He believed he had successfully orchestrated the perfect, untraceable murder, securing the massive $40 million empire for himself and his psychopathic mother. He was literally laughing while preparing to burn us alive in our concrete grave. I held Lily tighter, feeling the steady rise and fall of her chest beneath the heavy military gas mask. I focused entirely on her breathing, letting the rhythmic mechanical sound anchor my fading consciousness as the toxic fumes continued to brutally assault my senses. My vision was completely black, my mind teetering on the very edge of total unconsciousness, but I absolutely refused to let go. And then the pristine world outside the vault completely erupted in a symphony of glorious violence. It started with a tremendous, deafening crash that shook the entire concrete foundation of the commercial building. The thick, soundproofed glass windows of Patricia's beautiful clinic shattered simultaneously, a massive, violent explosion of falling glass raining down onto the city streets below. The arrogant laughter vibrating through the steel door was instantly cut off completely, drowned out by the sudden, overwhelming wail of heavy police sirens tearing through the early morning silence. The chaotic noise of destruction echoed rapidly through the walls. Heavy booted footsteps pounded aggressively against the roof of the building, followed by the sharp, metallic zip of tactical ropes as a highly trained SWAT team aggressively rappelled down the exterior walls, smashing through the remaining window frames with heavy tactical battering rams. I could hear the sheer, unadulterated panic completely overtaking the people standing right outside my door. Derek screamed a high-pitched, terrified sound that entirely betrayed the cowardly little boy hiding beneath the murderous corporate facade. Heavy, forceful impacts rattled the floorboards as Captain Jenkins and his heavily armed operators kicked down the reinforced doors of the main office suite, storming into the clinic with overwhelming coordinated precision. Through the thick metal barrier, the muffled sounds of a violent, desperate struggle played out. Derek tried to run away. I could hear his frantic footsteps sprinting across the gasoline-soaked carpets, desperate to reach the service elevator and escape the trap. But he did not make it far. A loud, heavy crash echoed through the suite as 3 heavily armored tactical officers tackled him violently to the ground, pinning him brutally against the floorboards, screaming fierce commands that vibrated through the solid walls. The distinct sound of heavy metal handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists brought a fierce, triumphant surge of adrenaline to my fading, exhausted heart. But Patricia did not run. According to Thomas, who later recounted the final chaotic moments of the tactical raid, she simply froze in place. She stood perfectly still in the center of her beautiful ruined office, the heavy gold-plated lighter hovering just inches above the highly flammable gasoline-soaked rug. The sudden, overwhelming intrusion had completely shattered her meticulously constructed reality in a matter of seconds. The heavy armored boots of the tactical team surrounded her, their automatic weapons raised and leveled directly at her chest. The bright flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers gathered in the busy street below pulsed violently through the shattered, broken windows, illuminating the absolute horror spreading across her perfectly contoured face. Her sweet maternal smile was entirely gone, replaced by the stark, terrified realization that her flawless, untouchable empire was completely destroyed forever. The heavy gold lighter slipped from her trembling, manicured fingers, clattering harmlessly onto the wet, saturated carpet, without striking a single spark. Captain Jenkins stepped forward, his voice a booming, authoritative roar that commanded the chaotic room. He ordered his men to secure the perimeter and rip down the massive oak bookshelf hiding the vault. As I lay in the freezing, toxic darkness, clutching my daughter tightly against my chest, the heavy steel door suddenly groaned, the digital locks forced open by a specialized hydraulic breaching tool. Bright, blinding tactical lights flooded the dark concrete cell, cutting swiftly through the thick clouds of chemical gas. Strong hands reached in, grabbing my shoulders, pulling us out of the freezing, suffocating nightmare and into the bright, flashing light of our ultimate salvation. The grinding, agonizing shriek of tearing metal pierced the thick, toxic fog of our concrete tomb. It was the most magnificent sound I had ever heard. The massive hydraulic jaws of a specialized breaching tool, wielded by firefighters clad in heavy protective gear, bit deeply into the narrow gap between the heavy steel door and the reinforced cinder block frame. The immense pressure built rapidly a low mechanical whine that vibrated intensely through the rubber matting beneath my boots. The heavy locking bolts finally gave way with a thunderous, explosive crack that echoed through the ventilation shafts. The heavy slab of industrial steel was violently pried open, pushed back along its greased tracks by sheer, unadulterated brute force. A blinding solid wall of pure white tactical light flooded the pitch-black vault, instantly cutting through the dense, swirling clouds of chemical gas that had been rapidly suffocating me. I stood up from the rusted medical bed, gathering every last remaining ounce of strength in my aging, failing body. I wrapped my arms securely around Lily, lifting her frail, emaciated frame against my chest. She was as light as a handful of dry autumn leaves. Her face was completely obscured by the heavy military gas mask I had strapped over her features, the rhythmic hiss of its filtration valves, the only proof she was still alive. My own lungs were searing with a terrible fiery agony. My vision swam with dark spots and every breath tasted of sharp acidic poison, but I absolutely refused to collapse. I carried my daughter toward the blinding light. Strong, heavily gloved hands reached through the widening gap, grabbing my shoulders and guiding us out of the freezing, suffocating nightmare. We emerged from the dark, secret corridor and stepped directly into the chaotic, ruined remains of Patricia's luxurious psychiatric suite. The contrast was incredibly jarring. The expensive mahogany furniture was completely destroyed, overturned, and smashed by the aggressive tactical entry. The thick Persian rugs were completely saturated with the pungent, overwhelming stench of industrial gasoline pooling in dark, dangerous stains across the floorboards. The massive soundproofed glass windows overlooking the city street had been entirely blown out, allowing the freezing morning air and the deafening wail of dozens of police sirens to pour into the room. Heavily armored tactical officers swarmed the suite, their automatic rifles raised, and their faces hidden behind dark ballistic helmets. Paramedics rushed forward the moment I stepped into the light, reaching out to take Lily from my arms. I gently lowered her onto the bright yellow stretcher, they had quickly unfolded on the ruined carpet. I watched them immediately begin checking her vitals, securing oxygen lines over her face, and wrapping her in thick thermal blankets. A paramedic grabbed my arm, shining a small penlight into my dilated eyes, loudly demanding that I sit down and accept medical attention for the chemical gas exposure. I pulled my arm away. I ignored the intense burning in my chest and the violent trembling in my hands. I told them I was fine. I refused to leave the room until I finished exactly what I had come to do. I turned slowly, my boots crunching over the thick layer of shattered window glass covering the floor. Across the ruined suite, surrounded by 3 armed officers, stood Patricia. She was already in heavy steel handcuffs, her arms pinned securely behind her back. Derek was nowhere to be seen, having already been dragged out to a waiting transport vehicle. But Patricia was not giving up. Even now, standing in the ruins of her criminal empire, surrounded by the physical evidence of her horrifying actions, the master manipulator was desperately trying to spin one final elaborate lie. I watched in absolute disgust as her face transformed. The cold, dead stare of the psychopath vanished instantly, replaced by the frantic, tearful expression of a terrified, deeply concerned medical professional. She looked directly at Captain Jenkins, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured panic. She begged the officers to listen to her. She cried out that they were making a terrible mistake. She claimed that I was suffering from severe advanced dementia and a tragic mental decline. She pointed her manicured, handcuffed fingers toward the stretcher where Lily lay, raising her voice to sound like a desperate mother. She told the police that my stepdaughter was suffering from a violent, untreatable schizophrenic break. She lied smoothly, claiming Lily was a severe danger to herself and others, and that the hidden room was simply a highly specialized private medical quarantine designed to keep her safe while Patricia administered emergency psychiatric treatment. She said Derek was only using the gasoline to destroy contaminated medical waste. It was a brilliant, flawless performance delivered with the absolute conviction of a woman who had spent her entire life deceiving everyone around her. Captain Jenkins stood perfectly still, his hardened face an unreadable mask, as he listened to her frantic, desperate excuses. He looked over at me, waiting. I did not yell. I did not scream. I did not let the boiling rage in my chest show on my face. I walked slowly across the gasoline-soaked carpet, stopping just a few feet away from the woman I had once foolishly trusted with my life. I reached into the deep inner pocket of my dark jacket. My fingers closed around the small black digital audio recorder I had carried with me since the moment I began my investigation. I pulled it out, holding it up in the bright tactical lights. I pressed the playback button and turned the volume to its maximum setting. The pristine high-definition audio filled the ruined office. It was the recording from the encrypted bug Thomas had planted in her vehicle and the footage from the surveillance cameras. But more importantly, it was the exact audio of Patricia and Derek standing outside the steel door just moments ago. Her own clear, cruel voice echoed through the room, mocking me, admitting to the embezzlement, bragging about the poisoning, and gleefully detailing her plan to let us die in the gas chamber so she could inherit the $40 million empire. Patricia's perfectly manufactured tears instantly stopped. Her mouth fell slightly open. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her skin a stark, ghostly white. The arrogant, untouchable queen realized in that exact moment that she had been utterly and completely defeated. I reached into the heavy canvas duffel bag slung over my shoulder. I pulled out the thick, bound folders containing the devastating, forensic financial audits Thomas had meticulously compiled over the last month. The documents detailed every single stolen penny, every offshore account, and every forged signature. I tossed the heavy stack of files onto the floor, letting them land with a heavy thud directly at Captain Jenkins's heavy tactical boots. I looked the captain straight in the eye, my voice a cold, raspy whisper that carried the full weight of a father's vengeance. I told him to take out the trash. The transition from the violent chaos of the clinic raid to the cold, sterile environment of the federal courthouse was a blur of agonizing waiting and meticulous preparation. The wheels of absolute justice began to turn with a slow, grinding inevitability that offered no mercy and absolutely no quarter. I used every single ounce of my remaining wealth, my corporate influence, and my boundless fury to ensure the prosecution had an airtight, indestructible case. I hired the most ruthless team of legal experts in the country to assist the federal prosecutors. We did not accept any plea deals. We did not entertain any negotiations. We demanded a full public trial to completely expose the horrifying depths of their depravity to the entire world. While Lily remained in a highly secure private medical facility, slowly and painfully regaining her strength and learning how to speak again through intensive vocal therapy. I sat in the front row of the courtroom every single day. I wore a tailored, immaculate charcoal suit. I sat perfectly upright, my hands folded, resting on my cane, watching the complete and utter destruction of the monsters who had tried to steal our lives. Derek was the first to fall. The arrogant, entitled stepson completely crumbled under the sheer insurmountable mountain of physical evidence. The prosecution presented the biometric banking tablet he had brought to the clinic, the industrial gasoline soaked into his clothing, and the digital fingerprint data linking him directly to the offshore accounts holding the stolen millions. They played the audio recordings of him laughing as he prepared to light the match outside the concrete vault. When he realized Patricia was going to let him take the fall for the attempted arson, he panicked. He tried to turn state's evidence against his own mother, weeping on the witness stand, like a terrified child, claiming she had manipulated him into poisoning my medication. The jury did not care. The judge looked down from the bench with absolute freezing contempt. Derek was stripped of his expensive suits and his corporate titles. He was sentenced to 25 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for grand larceny, conspiracy to commit murder, and attempted arson. I watched him being led away in heavy iron shackles, his head bowed, weeping uncontrollably. I felt absolutely nothing for him. Then came Patricia. Her trial was a magnificent display of absolute ruin. The woman who had obsessed over status, wealth, and pristine appearances was systematically stripped of everything she had ever valued. The federal government seized every single asset she possessed. They froze the offshore accounts, repossessed her luxury vehicles, and liquidated her personal properties to pay back the stolen funds. The medical board permanently revoked her psychiatric license in a highly publicized hearing, ensuring she would never practice medicine or hold a position of authority ever again. But the financial ruin was only the beginning. The prosecution brought out the physical evidence from the hidden room. They displayed the heavy steel chains, the rusted medical bed, the boxes of lethal sedatives, and the toxic chemical gas canisters. They showed the jury the horrific medical photographs of Lily's emaciated, bruised body. Patricia tried to maintain her stoic, superior facade, sitting at the defense table, with her chin raised, but as the trial dragged on, the sheer weight of the public revulsion began to crush her. The day of her sentencing finally arrived. The massive federal courtroom was packed to absolute capacity. The air was thick with a tense, electric anticipation. The judge, a stern, unforgiving man with decades of experience on the bench, read the verdict. For the crimes of kidnapping, severe torture, extortion, medical malpractice, and the attempted murder of both myself and my daughter Patricia, was handed the absolute maximum penalty the law would allow. She received a life sentence in a federal prison without the slightest possibility of parole. She would die in a concrete cell, completely erased from the privileged world she had killed to conquer. When the judge pronounced the words of her permanent sentence, Patricia's carefully constructed sanity finally snapped. The elegant, untouchable facade completely shattered. She collapsed against the heavy wooden defense table. She began to scream. It was not a calculated, manipulative cry. It was a raw, guttural shriek of absolute primal terror. She fought against the heavy hands of the federal marshals as they grabbed her arms to drag her away. She twisted her body around her wild, tear-streaked eyes, searching the crowded courtroom until they locked onto mine. She pulled against her restraints, sobbing violently, the heavy chains rattling around her wrists. She begged me. She cried out my name, screaming that she was sorry, pleading for me to forgive her, begging me to use my influence to save her from the dark, miserable future stretching out before her. I sat in the front row, perfectly still. I did not smile. I did not frown. I did not move a single muscle in my body. I simply stared right through her as if she were made of glass. I looked at the woman I had once loved, the woman who had chained my only child to a rusted bed in the dark, and I let her see the absolute terrifying emptiness in my eyes. I let her see that to me she was already entirely dead. She was nothing more than a ghost, a piece of trash being swept out of my world forever. Her frantic, desperate screams echoed off the polished wood paneling of the high ceilings as the marshals finally dragged her backward through the heavy wooden doors. The heavy, polished wooden gavel struck the sounding block with a sharp, echoing crack that finalized the judgment. The horrific chapter of our lives was officially permanently closed. It was finally over. The Pacific Ocean stretched out before us in a vast, unending expanse of shimmering turquoise, the gentle rhythm of the waves rolling against the Malibu shoreline, providing a peaceful soundtrack to the evening. 6 months had passed since the night the darkness finally retreated, and the harsh, biting chill of that final Chicago winter felt like a distant, faded memory. I sat in a comfortable, weathered wicker chair on the balcony, the warmth of the setting sun soaking into my bones. Beside me, Lily sat tucked into a soft, oversized blanket, her eyes fixed on the horizon as the sky shifted from brilliant gold to a deep, bruised violet. She looked like a completely different person. The hollow, skeletal angles of her face had softened with the steady return of her health, and the sickly pallor that once haunted her skin had given way to the warm, healthy glow of someone who was finally, truly living again. The angry, dark bruises that had once marked her arms from those endless months of forced sedation were nothing more than faint silver lines fading with every passing day. I reached out my hand, trembling slightly, as I rested it on her shoulder. She leaned into my touch, a small, genuine smile curving her lips as she rested her head against my shoulder. The most miraculous change, however, was her voice. It was no longer the raspy, broken wheeze of a dying girl. Through months of grueling patient vocal therapy, her strength had returned, her tone restored to the clear, melodic pitch I remembered from her childhood. We sat in the comfortable silence that only people who have stared into the abyss together can truly understand. My corporate empire, Vales and Associates, was currently flourishing under the steady, iron-handed leadership of Thomas. He had spent the last half a year purging every trace of Derek's toxic influence, cleaning out the shell companies, and restoring the firm to its former legitimate glory. My reputation was completely untarnished, and the company was stronger than it had ever been. But those trivial business victories felt like shadows compared to the reality of the girl sitting right next to me. I looked out at the tide, reflecting on the long, winding path that had led me to this moment. I had spent nearly 70 years of my life building massive skyscrapers, relentlessly chasing bottom-line profits, and foolishly placing my absolute trust in people who were only waiting for the right moment to hollow me out from the inside. I thought about the man I had been before that fateful morning at the clinic, a man who defined his entire existence by his net worth and the size of his legacy. I had been so blind, so profoundly arrogant, believing that I had successfully mastered the world simply because I had accumulated a fortune. I realized now that the empire I had built was a fragile construction, easily toppled by the greed of those I had brought into my own home. But as the sun dipped below the water, painting the clouds in vibrant streaks of fire, the truth finally crystallized in my mind. True wealth is not the gold in your vaults or the boardrooms you command. True wealth is the fragile, miraculous heartbeat of the blood you protect. They had all underestimated me. Patricia, Derek, the entire network of vultures circling my life. They had all looked at my graying hair and my failing heart and seen nothing but a weak, doddering, clueless old man. They assumed I was obsolete, a relic of a bygone era that could be easily manipulated and discarded. They were so busy counting my money that they failed to realize I was watching every single one of their moves. A father's intuition is the deadliest, most patient weapon on this earth. It is not something that fades with age, but something that sharpens forged in the fires of unconditional protection. I would have gladly burned down the entire world, every single structure I had ever built, just to ensure my daughter could breathe one more breath of fresh air. I squeezed Lily's shoulder, and she looked up at me, her eyes clear and filled with a profound sense of peace. There was no more fear, no more terror of the dark vault, and no more shadows of the monsters we had left behind. We had survived the fire, the gas, and the betrayal. We were the victors in a game they never should have dared to play. The ocean breeze picked up, carrying the salt and the promise of a quiet, undisturbed night. I took a deep, steadying breath, finally feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of the past 6 months lift from my spirit. I was still the same man who had built an empire, but I was also something much more. I was a father who had walked through the depths of hell to bring his child back into the light. I watched the last sliver of the sun vanish beneath the waves, the darkness creeping over the water. But I did not feel the cold anymore. I was ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. For the first time in my entire life, I was finally, completely, and undeniably home. I held my daughter close, watching the stars ignite across the sky, and felt the perfect, absolute stillness of a battle finally won fade to black.